Hello. Hi, this is Meg Riley here in snowy Minneapolis, Minnesota, where I'm excited to say the CLF board is all convening today. So I kind of feel like Christmas morning, like people I love are coming to do great work. So anyway, I'm a happy camper today. Christina, speaking of campers, you look like you are on the road there.
I am on the road. I'm with my family in the Outer Banks, just leaving Outer Banks, North Carolina to go back home. So if you see people in the car there with me, you'll know why they are guest hosts in the VUU today. So we're excited to be coming back home.
I'm sure they're enjoying this time with you. This quality time. Yes, exactly. Aisha.
Hi, I'm Aisha Hauser, and usually I'm at my home in Seattle. Today I'm actually at the church. I'm at East Shore Unitarian in Bellevue. And it is a regular rainy, gray day in Seattle area. So that's fun.
You got up really early to go.
At the butt crack of dawn. Yes, because I have an early meeting here right after. And so to try to leave, and then I never know what the I-90 bridge is going to be doing. So I figured I would just make it a super early day. So I was here at 7:30 a.m., which only happens for the VUU. You're welcome.
Okay, I told Christina earlier that she got extra credit for coming from the car, but you get it too. Okay, lots of extra credit today. And on tech, we have Jessica Starrocker, who often is behind the chalice, but this one you get to see her face. Jessica?
Good morning. I am also in the dark, rainy Seattle area, and but I'm in my house, thank goodness. So I didn't have to go anywhere that early this morning. But
it looks very dark behind you.
Yeah, it's that kind of a day. I am on Twitter and I'm on Facebook and I'm here on the YouTube chat. So you can catch me at #TheView. So ask me any questions and I'll pass them along to our hosts.
And Michael Tino is in New York without power today, so he won't be joining us. So we have an all-female International Women's Day show today, which I'm quite excited about. And I'm excited about our guest who has written a book and just published it. And we're excited to be one of her first media interviews. Anna Levy-Lyons is the senior minister at First Unitarian Congregational Society. That is a mouthful. First Unitarian Congregational Society in Brooklyn, New York. She's also the author of No Other Gods, The Politics of the Ten Commandments. And one of the titles she considered that didn't pan out, we use today, which I love too, The Ten Commandments, a Radical Manifesto for the 21st Century. So that's what we're going to be talking about, is Anna and her book. And Anna, let's just start with, how did you come to write this book?
Well, I had been senior minister here in Brooklyn for maybe a couple years, and people were starting to trust me and kind of give me some leeway in what I might do. And so I took what I thought was a risk of preaching on a biblical topic that is often associated with the religious right. The Ten Commandments have really been, in my mind, appropriated by the religious right, and we mostly think of them in terms of people like Roy Moore and Lynn Westmoreland, who want to get them installed in courthouses across the country, and so I think that many progressives tend to sort of write them off as either something that belongs to the religious right or as something that's the Ten Commandments are thought of as just ethical, self-evident ethical guidelines that we don't really have any need for anymore. Everyone just already agrees on that. Yeah, don't kill, don't steal, right? But I felt that there was great depth to be found in this biblical tradition. I find amazing depth in a lot of biblical traditions that I feel like as liberals we tend to overlook. But there is actually a long heritage of looking at these ancient texts and finding in them not only relevant material for our contemporary time, but politically radical material. And so this is what I wanted to bring to the congregation. So I preached a sermon series on the Ten Commandments. I did one each month. And I didn't know how people were going to react to it, but people loved it. People told me this was their favorite thing that I ever did. They wanted to make sure that they knew when the next one was coming up so they could be sure to be there. The sanctuary was always packed on 10 Commandments Sundays. And people started saying, you really have to turn this into a book. You've got to turn it into seriously, you got to turn this into a book. And so I started to think about that, and one thing led to another, and I ended up writing a book. But it was really interesting to me and sort of powerful experience for me to see that what I found in the 10 Commandments, in this biblical tradition, was also really meaningful to this group of sort of liberal, these progressive people who often feel like they have no use for biblical traditions. That was something, I had found something that was real to other people as well.
What is it about them? Like, just start. What's your favorite commandment? I mean, what is a commandment that you feel like is either overlooked or people don't get what it could offer, or favorite is like, what's your favorite color? Sure. It's a question, but you know what?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a good question. So when I started the book project, I did an informal poll of what's your least favorite commandment, and a lot of people said the first one, because the first one says, "I am your God, you shall have no other gods before me." So to a lot of people, that speaks of exactly the kind of sort of narrow-minded tribal thinking that they associate with the 10 Commandments and the biblical tradition. But that's actually my favorite commandment. That, to me, sets the stage. I think that's the umbrella under which all of the other commandments fit, because the God in question, the God before which we are supposed to have no other gods, is identified by these 4 Hebrew letters. In English, the transliteration is YHVH. And those letters comprise the Hebrew verb to be. So that God is not a dude in the sky, right? It's not a white man with a beard sitting in the cloud somewhere. It is being itself. It's reality. So that by itself is incredibly cool, right? We're not talking about a tribal God. We're talking about reality itself. But if that were the entirety of the way that this God were described, it would be a very Buddhist understanding of God. God would just be what is. And the way to connect with that God would be through meditation, through accepting the reality that's before us. That God would not have a vested interest in our world, really, because everything would be equivalent from such a God's perspective. But the first commandment does not stop with that description of God. It says, "I am YHVH, who brought you out from the land of Egypt from a house of slaves." This revelation of the 10 Commandments came immediately after the Israelites were liberated from slavery in Egypt. And they were trying to figure out, how do we build a society that can be different from the society that we left? How can we build a society that's free from the kinds of oppression, the kinds of violence, the kinds of ranking of people, the kinds of excess from the society that we left? How do we create that world? And then here's God speaking to them for the first time, this revelation, saying, I am reality, I am being itself, but I'm not just any old reality. I am specifically the reality that brought you from slavery to freedom. I am that force of liberation in your life. You shall have no other gods but that force of liberation in your life. That's my favorite.
Wow. So I'm Egyptian. I was born in Alexandria. And growing up, my entire family's very observant Muslim. And when you were talking about how, you don't see God as a man in the sky with the beard, I also never internalized God as a male. So even though Allah is the, tends to be a gendered male, that's not how I internalize. And my mother would say, God is light, Rabbina Nur, God is light. And so as you were talking, I'm like, oh, that's kind of how he wasn't quite, what you said was amazing. I'm like, oh, I want to hear that whole sermon you did on that. But I had that same thing in common, that that interpretation of God as light and as energy and as the force or something that connects us and something that's not human, that isn't us. So I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Aisha, I thought you might talk about being Egyptian, because I was wondering how you related to that, about God being the one that took them out of Egypt. I was
so what's funny about that is my first Seder with, I have one family member who did not disown me, my uncle, my dad's brother. My father died when I was a kid, so his brother came to my wedding, and he was the one family member, him and his wife, who didn't disown me. So the first Seder with my in-laws and my one Egyptian uncle and me, my mother-in-law, when they got to the part about the slaves leaving Egypt or whatever it was about Egypt, she started apologizing. She's like, we don't mean you, right? This is so old, and it's just, it was hilarious. And we're like, you don't need to apologize for the Haggadah. We're good, And so it's hilarious that was our first Seder with the, Muslim, Egyptian, Jewish family, and it was hilarious. She just kept apologizing for anything that she thought we might be offended by. It was quite it's quite adorable. But yeah, it is interesting to hear that. But I also, my mother thinks Egypt is God's favorite country. So talk about exceptionalism. So I really don't take anything personally.
Right. There's another layer to that word Egypt in Hebrew as well. I don't know if you know this, but in Hebrew, the word for Egypt is Mitzrayim, and that is also in the mystical tradition a word that means a narrow place or a place of constriction, a place of oppression. So when mystics and contemporary interpreters look at that journey of liberation, you can see it on a political level, and you can also see it on a completely spiritual level, that this was an exodus from your own place of oppression, your own place of constriction.
Wow, that's beautiful. Thank
you.
Not
Egypt, the country.
No, right.
Yeah. I often feel when I'm in Jewish services, like, we're not talking about Israel, the country, right. It's really complicated because you hear so much about Israel, and I never thought, of course, Egypt is the same kind of thing where it's not how we think about it. So that's how you started. You led off with that one, and then I meant to look up the 10 Commandments before this started. I was thinking, could I even name them all? No, right. They get a little hazy in the top, kind of like the Girl Scout laws, but What do you think is the most kind of, so that was the one that people came in with the most resistance to. What do you think is the one that people could pay a whole lot more attention to? That you said sometimes people are like, yeah, duh, of course. Like, where do you think we overlook wisdom that seems obvious?
Yeah, I would say the Sabbath commandment. It's a really interesting one because it's very few of the so-called people of the book of all kinds actually keep a Sabbath, right? It's one of the top 10 commandments, right? It's up there with don't kill and don't steal, is keep a Sabbath once a week. And very few people do it. And modern liberal people, modern any people pretty much say, oh, well, we can't, right? We can't, we're too busy. There's too much to do, right? So there is something really radical in our world about a committed Sabbath practice.
Do you keep the Sabbath yourself?
I do. My family and I do. I was just talking with my husband last night about the fact that we sort of patting ourselves on the shoulder that we've been able to keep a Sabbath and do a lot of other stuff, raise kids and have jobs. And I wrote a book, and it's people who say, oh, you can't do in 6 days what everything that you need to do. I am living proof that actually you can. So, which is really interesting, because the idea of what you absolutely have to do is a choice, and it has a choice. It's a choice about what God you're worshiping, right? And so it's a wonderful opportunity each week. If you try to keep a Sabbath, it's a kind of spiritual weightlifting. Like, you reach the end of your week, and you have a choice. Am I going to belong to that inner power, that spirit of liberation, Or am I going to belong to my work, the approval of others, my things that I'm not good enough at yet, the ways I don't look good enough yet, the way, right, all of my inadequacies? Am I going to keep striving after all of those things 7 days a week? The alternative is to have 1 day a week where you say, you know what? I've done enough. I have enough. I am enough, and I can bask in the abundance of the universe, what I already have. And it's a really powerful thing, and it's an anti-capitalist thing, because our capitalist economy runs on the notion that you never have enough and you're never doing enough, and when you're not producing, you better be consuming, and that's all of your sort of fulfillment is going to come from consumption of one form or another, striving of one form or another. Our environmental disaster that we're facing right now is a direct product of that constant production, constant consumption, the sense that because everything that we produce and consume, it gets extracted from the earth at some point in its in its history. It came from the earth in some way, and so that constant cycle is literally killing us. And if people were able to keep a Sabbath, it would have a huge impact, both directly on just the amount of stuff that's produced and consumed, but also I think it would change our culture, change who we are as a people, to have that orientation that we're not owned. We don't have to be owned by that striving.
So, and what I would add to that, Anna, is that as keeping it as a commandment, then also not encourages us, but holds us to each other to that commitment, right? To make sure that people can have a Sabbath, that
Yeah.
our structures and our way of being in the world and what we ask of people holds that there's a Sabbath, because there's a lot of folks who would love to take a Sabbath, and they're not able to because of the way our economic structure is set up. That if they want to have a full-time job, at a retail outlet, it means that they have to be available for 12 4-hour shifts in order to make a 40-hour week. And so I think it's not just that personal commitment, right, to the Sabbath,
Yeah.
but the collective commitment to it.
That is such a great insight, and I think that there's a clear call in the commandments to not only keep them individually, but to keep them collectively. They are grammatically, the commandments are in first person singular. They are addressed to the community as a whole. The community as a whole is to keep a Sabbath. And the language around the keeping of the Sabbath it talks about not only you, and the you that it's referring to is probably the male head of the household, but not only you, but your son, your daughter, your male servant, your female servant, your animals, and the stranger, the alien who is within your gates. So you, the society as a whole, or you, the head of the household, are to make sure that it's not only a Sabbath for you, it's everybody, the people who work for you, the people who are aliens, who are not even citizens, and even your animals and the earth itself is to take a rest. And that is absolutely the heart of the commandment. And even in after the 10 Commandments, a little bit later in the biblical text, that commandment is sort of reiterated in slightly different language. And in that telling of it, it says the way that it's written, it sounds like it's only for the sake of the people who work for you, right? It's specifically for people who have less power than you. Like, that's why you should keep a Sabbath, specifically so that they can have the Sabbath as well. And the rationale goes back to the slavery in Egypt. The reason given for keeping the commandment of the Sabbath is because you were once slaves in Egypt.
So my question is, what's the sort of your modern interpretation of what keeping the Sabbath means? What would that mean for someone wants that to be their practice and they're not sure where to begin?
Yeah. Well, I can tell you what I do in my family. Well, we don't do any work for money. We don't do errands. We don't buy stuff. We also try to not engage with difficult issues. Like if we have family issues, problems to be worked out, we try to just let that go for that period of time. And we spend that time with each other. We go for walks without any particular destination. We will cook meals for friends. A Sabbath dinner is a really wonderful thing. It's amazing how much when you simply take things off, like when you decide what you're not going to do, amazing how much that the time gets filled with all kinds of beautiful things. It's not like, oh, I'm bored, because there are so many wonderful things. We can read books. We try not to do email, except if it's for making plans with friends, but I'm certainly not checking work email. Because I'm a minister, I make exceptions for pastoral emergencies, or if somebody really needs to have their wedding or funeral done on my Sabbath, I'll do it. But aside from that, I don't make exceptions.
Do you keep it on Saturday, Anna?
I do, yeah. Yeah, obviously I couldn't do it on Sunday.
Yeah, no, that's just amazing that a congregation will support that, actually.
Yeah.
Think of all the Saturday work that people do in congregations.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think some people are not happy about it, but I think and I hope that people have come to see it as more positive than negative, because I feel like I'm able to bring so much more richness and depth and more of myself and be grounded. And I think it's a gift to model a serious commitment to a spiritual practice for the congregation. And I have been encouraging people to also keep a Sabbath, and some people are trying it in different ways to different degrees. And that's very exciting to me, when I feel like I can bring the richness of a tradition like this to the congregation and people are finding it meaningful. Like, that's just the best thing.
How old are your children? I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to ask about your children, how old they are and how you talk them through Sabbath. My son's a wrestler, and I'm thinking, gosh, there is no Saturday, at least for about 5 or 6 months, that could be an option, that he couldn't be part of a wrestling tournament or something. So I'm curious.
Yeah. Well, they're only 7. So I have 7-year-old twins.
Oh, okay.
So we haven't really gotten into too many conflicts about that. But so far, they love it.
Oh, yeah.
They love it because they get time with their parents. They get our full attention, and we're not looking at screens. It's a beautiful thing. But what I think, there's been a lot written about Sabbath from a self-care perspective. What I'm more interested in, and what I think is more sort of radical about it, has to do with the political side. The stepping outside of the cycle of production. It's really deeply countercultural. And the fact that it's so difficult for people, the fact that that it's like, no, but I have to do that. I have to do this and I have to do that. That's exactly what makes it so powerful, because it creates a conflict every week. And you have to deal with that and decide sort of who you are and what you value every single week. And if people really did that in this culture, we'd have a very different world.
So what else is radical about the 10 Commandments?
I see the commandments against killing and stealing, because they are addressed in the singular to the community as a whole. I think that it's irresponsible to not extend that understanding to include systemic theft and systemic killing. So that makes those commandments not simple at all, right? You can go through life without ever stealing somebody's cell phone or without directly killing anybody, but we are all embedded in systems that are killing many, many people in this world, and that are stealing from people, stealing wages, stealing from the common good of clean water and clean air around the world. And we are, through our actions, responsible for those deaths. Right? We live in a racist culture. We live in a culture that is killing people through climate change. We are living in a world where poor people are dying at alarming rates because they can't get basic care that they need. And those of us in, affluent countries who think that we're not killing anybody are actually complicit in all of that. So I think that the commandment, and I'm not the first one I'm not just making that up, that extending it in that way. Rabbis from the beginning of interpreting the commandment, do not kill, have extended it in different ways. All the rabbinic commentators, maybe not all, but many of the rabbinic commentators will extend it to mean failure to save a life that you could save, for example, or withholding a secret that could save a life, right? Drug companies that with their patents on particular drugs and they don't make them available at a price that people can afford, that's withholding a secret that could save a life, right? People can't afford those drugs and so they die. Right? So
how do you handle I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm done.
I'm just curious about how you handle the covet thy wife one.
Covet,
or not covet, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife.
So the coveting commandment in general, you mean the 10th commandment? You're not talking about adultery.
Oh no, I am talking about adultery.
Adultery, okay.
I'm curious how you handled
adultery and coveting. We want to hear about both.
yes. Exactly.
Okay. Well,
I'm mixing up my commandments. Sorry.
That's okay. It's okay. So they're related, obviously, but the adultery commandment I think is interesting because on one hand, I think it's very valid for us to take it at face value, right? You make a sexual commitment to somebody, you should keep that commitment. And when you don't, there's an interesting way of reading the 10 Commandments where if you put the first 5 up next to the second 5, as they were mythically imagined to be on the 2 tablets, there's actually a lot of meaning to be found in when you read them across horizontally. And the commandment about adultery is across from the commandment about idol worship. So when you pursue a relationship outside of your marriage, outside of your primary sexual commitment, it is as if you are looking to another God. You're looking to this outside source for the kind of meaning, the kind of depth, the kind of richness, the kind of healing and relationship that you really should be looking for in your primary relationship. And just like the idols are not actually able to give you what you pray for, they're not actually able to bring rain, and they're not actually able to grow your crops or make you fertile, neither is the extramarital partner. You're looking in the wrong place to find what you're really looking for. I want to feel younger. I want to feel more beautiful. I want to feel more vital, right? That's not going to be found in cheating on your spouse. So that's that's the most literal, the obvious meaning to be found there. But I think there's also a parallel to the way that we relate to consumer objects in our world. That just as people are disposable, and that we are in our culture, we're always ready to trade up with our partners. We relate to products in exactly the same way, although the causality probably goes the other way, right? We have learned from the commercial marketplace that you should always be ready to trade up. You should always be ready to get the next best, newest thing. If something breaks these days, we don't get it repaired, right? You can't even, we have a blender that's broken at home. We can't even find somebody who will repair it, right? They're like, oh, just buy a new one. Right, that's the ethic. That's the capitalist ethic that the world runs on right now. And what if instead we sort of almost re-sacralize the objects in our world, right, along with the people in our world, right? What if we were to say, no, when your blender breaks, you fix it, right? You're not going to just be ready to trade up, right? That you have the things of your world that you value them, even though they're imperfect. And the people in your world, you value them even though they're imperfect, and you're not going to look for salvation somewhere else.
So how about the coveting? I mean, there's a lot of talk about coveting in the 10 Commandments, right? As I said, I get a little fuzzy at the top, but it seems like there's a lot about coveting up there.
Well, the coveting commandment is the last one. And it's interesting because the other 10, maybe with the exception of the first, are behavioral, right? They're things that you actually do. And that's true of Jewish tradition generally. It's not, Christian tradition is more about sort of your internal spiritual state, your faith, right? Jewish tradition tends to be much more about what you actually do. But the coveting commandment is an interesting exception to that, because coveting is an internal experience. So you could see it as just a guardrail, a way of stopping you from breaking the other commandments, because, well, if I don't even covet my neighbor's wife, then I'm certainly not going to have sex with her. Or if I don't even covet somebody's cell phone, I'm not going to steal it. So you could see it as just a guardrail, like I'm going to try to not even covet these things, because then I won't take that next step of actually taking them inappropriately. But I think there's also a powerful lesson in, okay, so how would we, if we wanted to actually keep this commandment of not coveting things that don't belong to us, things that would be harmful for us to have in some way, what would it mean? How would you even keep that commandment? Because you can't just keep it directly. You can't just decide to not covet. So the way that I interpret that one is that you have to create the conditions in your life that will make it possible for you to not covet, or to covet less. And so to do that, you have to, I believe, create a countercultural bubble, a little bit of protection from all of the forces of society that actually intentionally induce coveting in us. So and I think that religion in general, Unitarian Universalism, has a great potential in this regard. Religion has the capacity to give us a space that is outside of the dominant culture, and to create a sort of experiment, a sort of community experiment in how can we in this world see each other differently. I think that the efforts at the recent efforts in the UUA of addressing white supremacy think that to do that, where you create a community where you have different rules, where it's a different game than in the outside world, so that you can have space to be a different person. And presumably that would be a person who would not be coveting all those things as much. We're never going to be free of it entirely, right? But it seems that keeping this commandment requires an indirect action of protecting ourselves from all the forces that induce coveting, which is pretty much all the forces in our dominant culture.
Well, and one of the things too that it makes me think about is that it sort of signals coveting as something that when you experience that, it's a moment to ask yourself what's going on, or sort of what's the internal experience that's leading you to feel that way, and signals that as work to do on yourself internally, as that experience as something where you can do some work.
Absolutely. Although I think for most of us, that feeling of coveting in the sense of feeling like we were not enough probably happens so frequently, like virtually all the time, that it would be hard to actually identify. Oh, there was one. I think we'd be lucky. We'd be doing really well if we could get to the point where our baseline was feeling good as we are, and then only once in a while we'd be like, oh, I just noticed that I wanted that thing that somebody else has. I wanted to be that other person.
So Aisha, were you coming in? What do you make of the idols? That's what I was wondering. I remember the golden calf coming down the street during the Occupy movement. It was so powerful.
Oh, yes. I love that. I remember that too. So the commandment about worshiping idols specifically says, don't make any sculpture or any image of anything that's in the skies or on the earth or in the water. And no sooner did this commandment get given out loud on Mount Sinai, but the people went and built a golden calf. Moses had been gone for a long time. He went up. I don't know if you know the sequence, but basically God speaks the 10 commandments out loud from Mount Sinai to the people as a whole. They completely freak out and say, Moses, don't ever make us hear directly from God ever again. That was a terrible experience. And so Moses says, okay, fine. And Moses goes up the mountain to get the tablets from God. And Moses has gone a really long time. And the people start to lose the thread of what that revelation had been, of who exactly and what exactly it was that liberated them from slavery. And so they take off all of their gold jewelry and they give it to Aaron, Moses's brother, and he fires them in a furnace and molds them somehow into a golden calf. You might wonder, where did they get this gold jewelry? These people had been slaves and they had been wandering in the desert. How did they get this gold jewelry? Well, they had gotten it from the Egyptians on the way out. They had sort of finessed, they had convinced, with God's help, the story goes, they had convinced the Egyptians to give them their gold and their jewelry on the way out of Egypt. And I think that historically, this was probably just a way, it was part of the military victory, because the victors have to sort of come away with the spoils. And so this was the literary mechanism for making sure that they had come away with the spoils. But on a spiritual level, it's really intense that what they make the golden calf out of is, first of all, their own status symbols. And second of all, something that had come from the place of their enslavement. They brought with them the gold from the place of their enslavement, and that was what they were worshiping. So it was like they are, on a spiritual level, recreating that condition of enslavement when they worship this thing. So Moses comes down the mountain. He sees that they're doing this. He gets so angry. He smashes the tablets, and he confronts his brother, Aaron. What did you do? Why did you do this? And Aaron says, I don't know what happened. We put the gold into the furnace and out pops this calf, right? He denies responsibility for having made it, that it had a life of its own, right? There were no human origins of this thing. This is reminiscent of the way that idols were generally created in the ancient Near East, where people would, they'd make the idol, but then there'd be an elaborate ritual to erase the human origins of it. The workman would throw his tools into the river. There'd be the ceremonial pretend cutting off of his hands. And he would say, I did not make this. I did not make this God. And then the God would have power. And also the mouth of the idol would be washed. There was called a mouth washing ritual. So then the God would be able to speak and have power, and you could pray to it. So I think that's really amazing that Aaron basically does that same thing. He says, it just popped out of the fire like this, right? I didn't create this. And I think the political connection here is that we do this with brands. This is what we do in our society with brands, that we create these brands, and there's often a lot of ugliness that goes into the creation of a product that has a particular brand. There's often workers who get paid slave wages, or they're working in factories in the third world that collapse on them because they're not built well enough. They're often built at the expense of the environment and the clean water and air, and in places where poor people in poor communities are getting all of the detritus and toxins from the creation of that product. So there's this very messy, ugly, even evil process that goes into making these products. And then in some clean, cool office buildings, in some cities somewhere, they create the brand. and they create that image of what this product is and what powers it will give you if you eat this thing, or if you buy this thing, or you wear these sneakers, or you have this particular computer. And there's a very deliberate process of erasing the human origins of these products and just showing people the shiny, glittery brand, which people then buy. They make a sacrifice of money. They make a sacrifice of their attention and desire for this object. And they believe, just like people who worshipped idols back in the day, when we buy these things, we believe that they're going to give us special powers. They're going to make us more beautiful. They're going to make us stronger. They're going to make us tougher. They're going to make us a member of a particular subculture. And so we give our power away.
And just like
idols.
Aaron, these manufacturers say, it wasn't us. We don't know how this happened.
Exactly.
So it's an excellent analogy. I wonder how do you and I can't wait to read your book now. I'm so excited. How do you tackle the honor thy mother, thy father? And what I'm getting at is, I mean, when you've had a functional family where everyone, gets along and neither is an alcoholic or abusive or has issues, sure, it's pretty easy to honor thy mother and father. But what if that's not the case? And how do you deal with the, parents, I think, out of anybody can do the most damage to their children.
Yeah.
And people, who come, I imagine, speaking from personal experience, you go to a faith community because maybe you were wounded as a child, maybe by one of your parents or both. So how did you approach that?
Yeah, that is really a tricky one, and it's for exactly the reason that you're saying. It's so personal, and people who are from abusive families or families who just aren't there, and they were abandoned, or their parents are dead, or any number of reasons that. So the rabbis actually call this the most difficult commandment. I think for exactly that reason. There's I think an answer lies in what does it mean to honor somebody? And I think the rabbis are very clear that it doesn't mean to obey them. So if you that if you feel that what they are asking you to do is not going to that you would have to sacrifice your own sense of self or your own safety in order to do what they're asking you to do, then you're not obligated to do that. I think that the obligation, at least in the rabbinic analyses, is around that you have to provide material care for them. That's sort of the baseline of what honoring means. Like if they're hungry, you have to do your best to feed them. But it doesn't mean that you owe them anything else. You don't owe them your selfhood. You don't owe them your obedience or compliance or with their vision of who you should be. You don't even necessarily owe them ever speaking to them or seeing them if you can't do that and remain a whole person. I think it's very narrowly, that you are obligated to take care of them financially, physically, if they need that. Like the other commandments, I think there's also a broader interpretation of this one, which has to do with source, honoring your source and where you came from in the broadest possible sense. And we are parented by many people who are not our biological parents, right? And there's a sense of that we owe that kind of honor, that kind of care to everybody, to our entire community that made us who we are. And there's also, I think, a connection to the source that is the earth. I think there's a legitimate environmental, ecological interpretation of this commandment. The concept of Mother Earth is the connection between mother and earth is something that is in many different cultures and languages, that connection is made. And it's really interesting in this commandment that the commandment says, honor your father and mother so that your days will be long on this earth that God has given you. And the word for earth, usually in a phrase like that in the Bible, that's talking about the land. It's actually translated as the land, meaning the land of Israel, right? That's the sort of geopolitical land that they're talking about. But in this case, it's not the word that means land. It's the word that means actual earth, soil. So honor Mother Earth so that your days will be long on this soil, on this actual earth that God has given you. So we need to honor the land itself, and the trees and the water and the atmosphere that allows us to have a climate that's livable, so that our days will be long on this land. And if we don't care, if we don't provide that material care for the earth, for our source, then our days will be quite a bit shorter.
I'm really curious, you're referring to the rabbis, and you had mentioned before we went on the air that you draw from the Jewish Renewal movement, and that you get a lot there. Do you see something comparable to the Jewish Renewal movement within Unitarian Universalism? Do you have colleagues who are as interested in reinterpreting scripture as you are, or do you mostly stick with the rabbis? I'm just curious where you find collegiality with this kind of interpretation and attention.
Well, I know Kelly Murphy Mason, who you had on. Did you just have her on last week? Yeah, so she's our community minister here in Brooklyn, and she considers herself a Christian UU. I haven't had a chance to look at her conversation with you, so I don't know if it was about that. But I know that she's someone who very much draws from Christian tradition in thinking about contemporary issues. What's his name? He's a new co-minister in New Jersey at Montclair.
Scott
Samuel Michael. Yes, thank you. Yes, I know that he's very interested in these questions as well, and he and I have talked a bit and want to talk more. I think that there is, or at least should be, a growing movement within Unitarian Universalism and progressive movements generally of looking back at some of these sources to draw from, because we have been so, as a people, as a Unitarian Universalist people, we have been on such a sort of rapid trajectory toward freedom, right? Intellectual freedom, emotional freedom. And for good reason. We have rejected these biblical traditions because there is a lot that's violent. There is a lot that's oppressive in these traditions. And so we've sort of understandably and rightly rejected a lot of that. But I think that there's a growing sense that, wow, if you completely kind of cut us off from our roots, from our theological roots, and we are just free floating in the atmosphere, that we've really lost something, and that part of what we've lost is having the kind of grounding in something substantial that will allow us to withstand all of the pressures of our modern day, like the oppressions of our modern day. I don't know how to say this without insulting anybody, but spiritual practices that are not sort of deeply rooted, I think, are insufficient to withstand the pressure of the entirety of the capitalist, market engine that we're subjected to on a daily basis. And so I think that part of why my sermon series was so popular is because people recognize that we want to have a deep ground for our progressive politics. We want to have something beyond just, well, I don't know, it just seems right to me, right? And so I think that I think there's a real hunger for finding that, if it can be found in our traditions.
I think that has to do with why people resonate so strongly with the principles, with the UU principles, is that hunger for something to claim and something to be our own. And I think in a way it's misdirected into the principles.
What do you mean?
Because I think that the principles are a covenant of how we want to be with each other. And I see the Ten Commandments as kind of a way that we want to be with each other, but also really in our Unitarian Universalist theology, it was actually there at one point. Whereas in both Unitarian and Universalism, in a way that our principles, because they're so new, and because they're evolving and changing, it doesn't ground us in the same way. I think it is what we're striving for, and I think that that's why we have this, we have this desire to change them or to add to them or to constantly be like, what do they really mean to us as Unitarian Universalists?
Well, I think that
people thinking, even making the comparison to the Ten Commandments, to our principles. And so I wonder if when you were doing this sermon series, if there was, if folks were trying to make that equivalency.
I think that the 7 principles perform a different function than the 10 commandments. The 7 principles are more aspirational. They're more sort of painting what the end goal might look like, right? A world community, democratic process, right? Reverence for the earth. So you sort of got, here's an end point that we're shooting for. The 10 commandments really are practices for the most part. Some, like I mentioned before, the first and the last one are internal, but the other are really practices. And it's sort of, I think of it kind of like exercise. It's like you don't really have to believe that it's going to work to do exercise. If you just do it, you're going to feel better. So I think it's the same thing, and I think that there's a real value in both. Right? I think we need both. I think we need actual practices that we can do, and then we also need sort of what's the aspirational vision. And so I think the 7 principles are more of that.
There's a really different kind of accountability in practices than in aspirations, right? And yeah, I thought that was really interesting when you were talking about coveting and how do you stop coveting. In a way, it's sort of like, how do you start valuing peace, liberty, and justice for all? like our principles, which I love, but they are, I don't know. It makes me think about, Jewish rituals of atonement and how much I envy that tradition of actually having a time every year when you make peace with things that you've messed up, and that it's structured in for everybody's doing it. You're part of a community doing it, and you're not left so out there on your own. So I'm curious. I mean, I think part of wondering if there are other colleagues is I'm wondering if you're saying how hungry the people in your church are for it. Are they hungry for the practice or just for thinking about it? I mean, do you feel like, it sounds like you're trying to actually practice these as your daily practice. Do you see other people wanting to do that in a disciplined way? Because it's hard work.
Yeah. I think people like the idea of it. I think it's very hard for people in our world. Unitarian Universalism doesn't have a built-in emphasis on people doing things because they are religiously obligated to do them, specific practices. So it's a different mindset that I'm trying to encourage my congregation to adopt, and I think it is happening slowly. I think, like I said, some people are experimenting with Sabbath practice. We are moving towards a plant-based diet for our congregational events, but it's slow. And there's resistance, and that's completely understandable because of all of the huge forces operating on us from our wider culture. And so it's a slow process.
Anna, I'm curious that if you can, in the time left, we have about 5 minutes. Why you became a UU minister instead of simply a Reformed rabbi? My husband's cousin is a rabbi, and she is, I think, somewhere in New York State. But I'm curious because it seems to me you would be a perfect fit for a Reformed a rabbi. You would be a great rabbi in a congregation, huh?
Or a Reconstructionist rabbi, yeah.
Or a Reconstructionist, yeah.
Yeah. I feel, well, first of all, I wasn't raised Jewish. everything I've learned as an adult. So this was not part. I mean, it was my heritage. My heritage is Jewish, but I wasn't raised Jewish, so I didn't have that. It didn't make. But I always wanted to be a religious leader. But becoming a rabbi seemed ridiculous because I just didn't have that background. I didn't know Hebrew. But also, I feel like I have a unique calling to liberal religion generally, but specifically Unitarian Universalists, because I feel like there is this thing that's missing that I feel like I can help bring. I feel like I said, there is this kind of longing for a connection, connecting our progressive politics with a deep spiritual tradition. And so I feel like that I'm sort of in the right place to do that, because I kind of speak both languages. And so I think it just feels like my ministry is kind of located in the place that it needs to be, because I have a real, I mean, if I were a rabbi, nothing that I've said today would come as any surprise or be particularly nourishing to rabbis or to Jewish congregations, right? But it is new to Unitarian Universalist congregations, and it is a gift that I feel like I can give to people, and that people are saying that they want and need in their lives.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I know a lot of my Jewish friends who were in Reform or, whatever kind of synagogue, that the Jewish Renewal movement woke them up in the same kind of way that you're saying you're waking people up. So I think for some, I mean, I think it would be a surprise to people in a lot of congregations that just don't get into the radicalness of the faith.
Yeah, Reform, yes, Reform, absolutely.
Yeah,
and Reform and conservative, this would be. It could be new for them. Yeah,
but it's really, I am very jazzed by it. I mean, I have to say, I had to look up I did look up the commandments as we were talking. I was like, what are we talking about here? They're not really a meaningful part of my life, but you've made them much more appealing. And I really do appreciate that, because there is a form of spiritual practice in what you're saying. And I'm always drawn to, new spiritual practice.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. Anything you didn't get to say that you'd like to say before we wrap up?
Just that one thing that I really appreciate about working in a Unitarian Universalist context is the freedom to sort of bring genuinely new sort of rituals, still drawing from traditions of various kinds, but we're developing at First Unitarian, we're developing rituals that we're doing every year. On Christmas Eve, for example, we actually anoint people with myrrh and frankincense and give them gold chocolate coins on their way out of the sanctuary. So we do a blessing on Christmas Eve. On Easter, we give each person a piece of flash paper, which is a piece of paper that explodes when it touches a flame, and they let go of what they have to let die in their lives. So I love the opportunity to create rituals like that, and I think that people crave rituals, and I think that can bring richness to people's lives.
Were you going to hold up your book? I don't think you did you?
Oh,
see the cover of that book. Woohoo! Look at that.
Yeah, and the mountains are Mount Sinai.
So where could people buy that?
Online in all of the usual places. It's in Barnes & Noble here in Brooklyn. I don't know if it's in Barnes & Noble across the country, but you can look for it. Certainly ask, and independent bookstores. That would be my first choice for where you would buy the book, would be at an independent bookstore.
Uh-huh.
And then if you're in the New York,
doing a book signing at GA at Kansas City?
I haven't figured out yet how to sell this book at GA, because I got turned down for doing a workshop there. So I don't yet have a context for selling the book there, but I want to try to figure that out. But if you're in the New York area, tonight I'm doing my release event here in Brooklyn. and next Wednesday on the Upper West Side of Manhattan at a bookstore called Book Culture. So those would also be opportunities.
Well, thank you so much for being here.
Thank
Next
you.
week,
So great to talk with you.
Yeah, it's been really great. Next week, both Aisha and Christina will be at Finding Our Way Home. So hopefully Michael will have power again and be back. We'll have Lisa Presley coming. She did research on what happens in religious communities when the religious leaders are in a time of profound grief and how that affects their ministry. That's what we'll be talking about next week. You can look, Jessica, you'll be posting on Twitter and the CLF Facebook page about how to buy Anna's book or the name of it and all of that. Thanks again to everyone. It's always wonderful to see you.
Thank you.